Greetings, it's time for another story, another true story. This time we're going to go back 50 years, a time when I used to live outside of Enumclaw, Washington. My old fishing buddy and I were kind of just sitting around. We were talking about going to New Zealand. Then all of a sudden we just looked at each other and said, "Hey, wait a minute, why don't we just go?" Around 6 months later, we had our passports and our tickets, and we were on our way to New Zealand. We flew from Seattle, Washington, down to San Francisco, from there to Honolulu, from there to Auckland, and from Auckland to Christchurch. My gosh, that was a long flight, over 20 hours. At Christchurch, we rented a car and took off on the wrong side of the road, not knowing where we were going to go or how we were going to actually get there. I've made 2 trips to New Zealand, both times to South Island, and mostly to explore and, of course, do some great fly fishing. As we traveled around the South Island of New Zealand, we mostly stayed at small little motels like this. At the time, I think you got 2 New Zealand dollars for every US dollar. And these things would cost us about, $10 to $12 a night. Included 2 beds, a living room, a full kitchen, television set, all kinds of stuff. So it came out to about $6 to $8 American. New Zealand had a very strange custom. Every time you check into a motel or a hotel, they would hand you a bottle of milk. And of course, it was the good kind of milk that came in glass bottles and had the cream on top. But I guess it was just a traditional thing they did. Now, of course, this is back in 1970s. What they do today, I don't know anymore. We ran into a lot of older New Zealand people who remember taking care of U.S. Marines during World War II. They put them up in their houses and fed them and so forth. Many of those Marines died at Tarawa. And a lot of people told us about different Marines they knew that had died on the Battle of Tarawa. I don't know what it's like now, but back then when we got talking to local people, they invited us into their homes all the time. They wanted us to spend the night with them, but we always had lunch or other things with them. They really liked Americans back then because they remember what happened during World War II. I don't know what it's like today, 50 years later. We always tried to find a motel or a hotel early. That way we could go fly fishing in the afternoons. No sooner we check into a room, about 10 minutes later there'd be a knock on the door. There'd be some guy standing there looking at you saying, "Are you guys the Yanks that want to go fly fishing?" We'd say, "Yep." Well, it wasn't long before they came by later and picked us up in their Land Rovers, and away we went to this top secret fly fishing holds. They would drive us to places we would never think about going to. They'd take us through fences and gates and all kinds of different places. Cross paddocks, that's what they call fields. They'd take us places fishing, usually to their favorite place. We'd never even find the place if we were on our own. We mostly stayed in the small towns in New Zealand. Of course, even back then in the 70s, there weren't big supermarkets or shopping malls like there are today. You'd go into a small town and you go into the grocery store and buy your groceries. And then you go over to the dairy place and buy the dairy stuff. I was always fascinated that the cheese and the butter were just sitting out on the open on the floor. They never even refrigerated it. You got your milk and glass bottles with cream on top. After you go there, you go over to the bakery. Once you get down to the bakery, you go over to the butcher shop and get your meat. It was kind of like living back in the 1940s and 50s in America. I really loved it. Now, this is the car that we rented. On the left is my friend Don Fraser. He's age 75. I was 23 at the time, so we were quite a pair. On the right is a guy named Maury. He was an old Scotsman living in New Zealand. Don and I were wearing old Seal Dry waders. I don't even know if they make those anymore. One of the first things we did when we got to town was buy a bunch of New Zealand clothes. Don's got his New Zealand shirt on, and I bought a farm jersey and a bunch of other clothes. Like here in Alaska, New Zealand has many different types of climate zones and geology and so forth. Here's Don and Maurice getting ready to fish up here by this lake here in this kind of a dry area in New Zealand. Some areas get like 200-300 inches of rain, and other places are like a desert. And it's a very small country, really a fascinating place. During the day, we'd fish for rainbow trout, but we'd also fish for the big brown trout. And we mostly fished for those really late in the afternoon and actually up into the dark. They seem to be more, the big brown trout seem to be more active at night. Here I am with a nice big rainbow trout. Most of them were about this size. I caught this one in the Clutha River. Sometimes we'd keep a fish and have it for dinner, take it back to our hotel motel, because all of them had kitchen and cooking areas in them. When we were fishing at night, after dark, I could hear all this coughing going on. And it sounded like people coughing all around me in the distance. And it turned out it was the sheep. And they told me they had picked up some kind of a lung fluke or disease or something that causes them to cough. But I'm not kidding you. You thought they were people all around coughing, but it was just the sheep coughing. All over the place on the old sheep ranches and farms, you'd find these old cars. I don't know how old most of them are. I think a lot of them are English cars or Australian cars. But it was an old car paradise if somebody wanted some old cars. We mostly fished the Clutha River, the Waitaki River, the Matura River. I think those were the main rivers we fished. Fished a few other places like Deep Creek and other places. Mostly fished late afternoon. This is a picture of the Clutha River. It was a very, very, very large river. What got me was those great big eels. Now, there's no snakes, no hazardous insects that I know of or anything like that in New Zealand. I guess the eels wouldn't hurt you, but they'd be in the water and they'd swim up next to you, and they'd be about 4 feet long or better, big around as your arm. They scared the daylights out of me. I think I'd rather run into a snake. Here's one of the typical New Zealanders we met. We met this gentleman down in Wanaka. Knew how to go fishing. Got his farm jacket on, cigarette in his mouth, and his beer in the back of his net. He knew exactly what he was doing. We never saw too many other fishermen around other than people we were fishing with. And the local New Zealanders, they fished a lot for meat. They kept a lot of fish, especially the rainbows, because they were the best eating. One of the places we visited was Milford Sound, Westland, and the west coast of New Zealand, which is pretty rough and pretty wet. This is Don fishing one of the streams that flows into Milford Sound. Before I forget, I guess I better get around to my main story. A number of people here on the Clutha told us about a place called Dean's Bank. Now, Dean's Bank is the area of river on the Clutha that is set aside when the British royal family comes to New Zealand, like the Queen and Prince Charles at that time, to do their fly fishing. So they told me that as long as the royals aren't around, that I could go up there and fish at Dean's Bank. One of the really neat things about New Zealand is that there's no private property along any river, stream, or lake. So you have access to everything. And they're not allowed, as you notice, to build houses along the rivers or around the lakes. If there is a place where you could fish or recreate in New Zealand, they can't keep you out. There's no private property. They don't let people build in these areas. And block off all the access like they do in America. Well, I decided to take everybody's advice and left Dawn back at the hotel or something. I can't remember. But I decided to go up to Dean's Bank, and I took the car, drove on the wrong side of the road as usual. We drive on the right side. They drive on the wrong side. Anyway, I was eventually able to find my way there and go through the gates and so forth, and through across the private property, but I mean, through the fields and different sheep ranches. I passed through all the gates, passed all the sheep, eventually found the stream again. And that was a beautiful looking place to fish. I mean, it's just gorgeous, Dean's Bank. As I was getting my waders on and stringing up my fly rod, I could hear this little slurping sound, and I looked out the river in front of me. There's this great big rainbow trout that was sitting behind a great big rock. And I was watching the little mayflies coming down, and that fish went up and sucked in one of those mayflies and dropped back down behind the rock. I was getting pretty excited. I eventually got myself positioned, whipped out that fly and dropped it right out in front of that rock. Right past over the top of that rainbow, and he ignored it. So, tried it again. He ignored it again. So I decided to try another fly. While I'm tying on another fly, another mayfly comes down, that big trout comes up, sucks it down. So I try again. I try a fourth fly, a third fly. I tied on another fly, a different fly. He ignored it. As soon as I started tying on another fly, I looked up. Here comes another mayfly down, or another little bug. And that dang blasted big rainbow comes up and goes, sucks it right down. Well, this went on for, 20, 30 minutes. But while it was going on, I noticed that somebody was sitting behind me on a log, smoking a pipe. So I just kept on fishing, and this person just kept on watching. Eventually, I figured out that I wasn't going to catch this fish. So I decided to walk back over to the shore. This gentleman, who was about in his 60s, I think, probably about 60, 65, he just looked at me and he says, "Well, I've been trying for that trout for years now. Never have hooked him. I didn't think you would either." He told me, he said, "That's Grandpa. I don't think anybody's ever going to catch Grandpa. He's probably going to die of old age." The old gentleman introduced himself, but I can't remember his name. He said he had been born right there on that sheep ranch, and that the sheep ranch belonged to his family. He fished once in a while, but he says most of the time he's so busy on the farm and on the ranch, he doesn't have too much time for fishing. He informed me that I was fishing at Dean's Bank, and that when the British royalty come to New Zealand, they just closed off large sections of the river right here, and this is where they fly fish. As far as he knows, none of them ever hooked into old Grandpa either. The old gentleman eventually asked who I was, and I told him where I came from, that I was staying 30 days in New Zealand to kind of wander around and fish. I was with somebody else who was back at the motel, and he was utterly astonished. He said, "You mean you flew 10,000 miles to come fish this stream behind my house?" You know, I and that old man in Dean's Bank in New Zealand, we sat there for hours talking to each other. I mean, we had so much to talk about. Now, I was in my 20s and he's in his 60s. We talked about fishing, and we talked about farming, and we talked about all kinds of things. It was really a fascinating experience. Learned a lot about sheep ranching, a lot about New Zealand. But one of the things that really fascinated me, now remember, he's fascinated because I had literally gone around the world to the other side of the world to go fishing in his backyard. He found that pretty interesting. But at the same time, he told me he was born on that sheep ranch, and he had never been more than 50 miles from home. I literally pointed to some ridges and things in the back, in the distance, and asked him what was there. He said he didn't know. This guy had never in his whole life been more than 50 miles from the sheep ranch he was on. I was just fascinated about this person. But we were fascinated in each other. It was a real good trip, a good conversation. But at the end, he couldn't figure out why I came so far to go fishing and try for some trout that wasn't going to hit my fly. So I hope you enjoyed this story. I'm going to have more stories about New Zealand, and I got a lot more stories about other places too. So stay tuned and keep watching. About every week or so I'll try to put one online and on my Facebook page. So want to watch them, fine. If you don't find, that's okay. But as I go through my pictures and all the things that I'm doing, I kind of have a coffee in the morning, and then all of a sudden, oh wow, I got to talk about that. That was an interesting subject. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little video, and thanks for watching.